I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Emily Bamforth. She's just recently joined the Royal Scotch Museum as a Curatorial Assistant here in East End, and her PhD, which she just got last October, actually focused on the material from Grasslands National Park and the Frenchman River Valley, primarily in the material from the Frenchman Formation just before the extinction event, and the soon events after the great extinction of the dinosaurs. And so we're pretty much up to speed in terms of our projects. In terms of we're going to have a very exciting summer activity, both here and in Regina and throughout the province as part of our natural jobs. And Emily will be definitely front and center in terms of that activity. So her first lecture is on unicorns under the microscope. This tale would be very interesting if the unicorns are real. I think that's half the battle. So anyways, this is Dr. Emily Bamforth.
It is so exciting to see so many people here tonight, and I really hope you enjoy this first lecture. As to mention, these lecture series are sort of about popular science, and so it's sort of science for the public, so in a way that's exciting and enthusiastic for you as well as for me. So the first lecture I want to talk about is about unicorns. Unicorns are something that I've been interested in for a while, primarily because they have a really interesting history. So I'm going to break this lecture into two parts. So the first one is about the history of unicorns. So where did unicorn mythology come from? And what are the uses of unicorns as a symbol? And the second part is a little bit more of a fun adventure in the science, what I'm calling the science of unicorns. So what would you do if you wanted to build your own unicorn? So we're going to look at the unicorn family tree, and these exciting things called Frank-unicorns, and I'll explain what those are. And mistaken unicorns. So throughout time, what animals and fossils have people mistaken for unicorns? And finally, we're going to end with, where would you find a unicorn today? So just to start out this lecture talking about the history of unicorn mythology. Unicorns actually have somewhat of an unexpected origin. And in this part, I have to thank my good friend from Montreal, Eliza Rosenberg, who is a religious studies student. And she was the one who really introduced me to the really interesting and exciting history of unicorn mythology. So in the background here, this image that you see, you'll probably recognize it as a depiction of the creation. So in the far corner over here is God. This is Adam and Eve. There's a snake. There's the tree. And you can see there's a variety of animals. And you might notice, if you have keen eyes, that there is a unicorn in there. And this is because unicorns actually have their origins in a variety of different religious traditions, but particularly Christianity. So this is how that happened. Somewhere around 250 BC, there was an effort to translate the parts of the Old Testament from the original Hebrew into Greek, so that more people could read it. And the Greek translation of the Old Testament is called the Septuagint. So around that time, you have the Greek scholars who are taking that Hebrew, translating it to Greek, and they came across a word they didn't recognize. And that word was ra'em. Now, they knew from the context of the word ra'em that it was a reference to an animal. So, for example, the Lord makes Lebanon skip like a calf, and Sirion like a wild ra'em. But you, O Lord, have lifted up the horns like that of a ra'em. God brings the people out of Egypt as if they had horns of the ra'em. Joseph's first bull has majesty and the horns of a ra'em. And save me from the mouth of the lion, my afflicted soul from the horns of a ra'em. So clearly this was a reference to an animal. But these Greek scholars didn't know what that animal was. They'd never come across this word before. So they knew from the context that ra'ems were hooved animals. They knew they were horned. They knew that they were somewhat elusive. That was, they were hard to find. And that they were powerful and or dangerous. So they scratched their heads and they thought, well, what animals do we know that sort of fit into most of these categories? I mean, is this a reference to a wild horse or a donkey, a wild ox, a deer? And the answer was no, because these Greek scholars knew what the Hebrew words for all of these animals were, and it wasn't ra'em. So it wasn't any of these. Now, around the same time, there were travelers coming in from the east that were bringing in stories and legends from particularly the Indus Valley, which now is India, and from Persia, which is modern-day Iran. So they're bringing these stories back to this area, and one of the stories they brought with them was the story of this strange one-horned beast. So this is kind of a depiction of what that beast might have looked like. It was very strong, it could run very fast, and it was very powerful. And so the Greek scholars thought that maybe this word ra'em was a reference to this mysterious creature from the Eastern cultures. And so they didn't have a word for this creature, so they made one up. They called it monokeros, which is Greek for one-horned. Now let's fast forward about 600 years to sometime around 400 AD. So at this time, with the Roman Empire, a lot more people were speaking Latin. So there was an effort to translate that Greek translation, the Septuagint, into Latin. And the Latin translation is called the Vulgate. So in the Greek, if you remember, ra'em had become monokeros, which directly translated into Latin is unicornus, unicorn. So that was the origin of the word unicorn. And so for almost a millennia, there were actually unicorns in biblical scriptures. So for example, you cannot make the unicorn serve you, make the unicorn plow for you. He tells those of Lebanon to dance like wild young unicorns. Save my humble soul from the lion's mouth, from unicorn's horns. So I just want to, for a second, fast forward about 1800 years. Sorry, 1800 years, yeah. Because you're probably wondering, well, if a ra'em wasn't actually a unicorn, what was this a reference to? And the answer to this came in the deciphering of a very ancient alphabet called the cuneiform text. So this is one of the earliest forms of writing known. And early in the 1800s, people were actually able to start deciphering what these letters meant and deciphering text that was written in cuneiform. So through this, they were able to determine that what ra'em actually was a reference to was an extinct animal. And this particular animal is found depicted in the Chauvet caves, which are about 32,000 years old. So these are caves in France that have paintings on the wall. And the animal is actually called an auroch. So these aurochs were very large, cow-like creatures. Very strong, very fast, very wild. So like something like, if you can think of a water buffalo from Africa, but like twice the size of that. These are actually thought to be the ancestors of all modern cattle. So the word ra'em actually refers to an auroch. And when those pieces of the Old Testament were written, aurochs were still around. When it was translated into Greek, the aurochs had gone extinct in that area, which is why they didn't know what that word referred to. So this is actually what a ra'em was referring to. But again, that was the early 1800s, so let's go back to about 400 BCE. And unicorns. So unicorns, because they were in the Bible, became very important for a lot of religious art. So for example, this is Raphael's painting Creation of the Animals. And so you can see this is a depiction of God. Here's a horse, there's a rhino here, there's an elephant, there's a bull, and right back here, there's a unicorn. Another really interesting piece of art that's actually a German fresco, dates back to about 1400s, is what's called the Holy Hunt. So this was a theme that involved unicorns in religious art. So this is the Virgin Mary, there's the infant Christ, and you can see that Jesus, this animal that he's riding, is actually a unicorn. So again, unicorns became an important part of religious art in particular. And it was through this association that unicorns really, their character really solidified. So unicorns in general were thought to be very powerful animals. They were thought to be very pure and very virtuous. So there was very little that was evil about unicorns. They were said to be uncorruptible, wild and untamable, difficult to find. So if you saw a unicorn, you were very, very, very lucky. And their horns, particularly, sometimes were thought to have healing properties. And that's a point I'll get back to in a little bit. But unicorns have always had a very strong association with girls and young women, particularly virgins, who are originally considered to be the purest of mortals. So because they were pure mortals, the unicorns were drawn to them. So this is a very popular theme in unicorn mythology, is this association with girls and young women. So I'll just mention briefly that there were unicorn-type creatures in other cultures and other religions as well. So for example, this is a Persian unicorn. This one is from Italy. These ones, again, this is another one from Persia, from modern-day Iran. And even from the Far East, there were some unicorn-like creatures that kind of look like a cross between a dragon and a unicorn. So this mythology was not just limited to Christianity, but it appeared elsewhere. And the unicorn mythology is really sort of a mosaic of all of these ideas. So starting about the mid-1500s, people started to get skeptical about unicorns. So I really like this tapestry here. You can see this is a classical unicorn picture. Here is the young woman. Here's the unicorn. And the person who made this tapestry had never seen a unicorn, so they just depicted it like that. What's really interesting is you know that there's also other animals. There's rabbits, there's foxes, there's some dogs in here. So the person who made the tapestry clearly knew what these animals looked like. Didn't really know what a unicorn looked like, but it's also clear they had no idea what a lion looked like. And this was because around that time, people didn't really travel very much. Like the common person didn't travel very much. So if you could tell a person, oh yeah, if you go to a place called Africa, there are these really big cats called lions, they'd believe you. And if you told them, oh yeah, if you go to sort of like the east, if you go to the east, there are these mythical, not even mythical, there are these one-horned creatures called unicorns. They'd believe you as well. So with the rise of globalization and exploration in the mid-1500s, people began to question why no one had actually ever seen a unicorn. And this continued failure to actually find a unicorn led to some very strong skepticism, which ultimately led to the rejection of the unicorn as a religious symbol. And because of this, unicorns sort of faded into obscurity for a long period of time. And it isn't until more modernly that unicorns have really made more modernly. It's only until more recently that unicorns have really returned as this sort of creature of myth and legend. So they pop up in all kinds of places. Some of the more popular movies that you've seen, Blade Runner, there's a unicorn in that. This is from the movie Legend, 1985. Anyone seen this movie? It's got a very young Tom Cruise in it. But you can see that even sort of a millennia after unicorns were first described, so to speak, they still retain this idea of being very virtuous, pure creatures. And so this is a quote from that movie Legend. Unicorns are safe from the Lord of Darkness. They can only be found by the purest of mortals. As long as they roam the earth, evil cannot harm the pure of heart. Here's a reference that some of you may be more familiar with. This is from Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. Anyone seen that movie? It's a good movie. So if you remember, in the first book, in the first movie, they're wandering through the wood and they find this dead unicorn. And there's a quote that says, "It is a monstrous thing to slay a unicorn. Only one who has nothing to lose and everything to gain would commit such a crime. The blood of a unicorn will keep you alive, even if you are an inch from death, but at a terrible price. You have slain something so pure and defenseless to save yourself, and you will have but a half-life, a cursed life, from the moment the blood touches your lips." So even in something as modern as Harry Potter, this ideal of a unicorn as a very pure, virtuous creature has still persisted. So the future of unicorn mythology, where is it going? Well, it's pretty much up to us where we want to take it. As my friend Eliza once said, and I just love this quote, "As it happens, the imagination is an ideal habitat for unicorns." So unicorn mythology is still going strong in our modern world, and it'll be interesting to see where it goes in the future. So that's sort of a background of unicorn mythology. Now I want to talk a little bit more about the science of unicorns. So let's say that you want a pet unicorn. What do? Well, our modern day depiction of a unicorn is basically a white horse with a horn. So could you take a white horse and just graft a horn onto its forehead? Probably not unless you had some really strong super glue. But with our modern science and our understanding of genetics, could you take a horse embryo, splice into it a horn development gene, and get a baby unicorn? Would that be possible? Well, let's explore that idea a little bit. So the first thing we have to do is understand what horns are. So out in nature, there's a couple of different kinds of horns, which you're probably mostly familiar with. There are true horns, so things like cattle and sheep and goats have got true horns. These are extensions of the skull, bony extensions, that are covered with a keratin sheet. And in most species, both the male and the female have horns, true horns. The other common type of horn is an antler. So as you know, deers, moose, caribou have antlers. They grow seasonally, usually only, in fact almost always, only the male grow them. And it's basically just a bone that grows out of the head and is shed every summer, every fall. The other types of horns that we have out there, one belongs to a giraffe. Only giraffes have got these. They're called ossicones. They're basically just bony extensions that are covered with fur and hair. Rhinos have an interesting horn. If you look at a rhino's skull, it actually doesn't have a horn on it. It's got a flat nose. And that's because the rhino horn is actually not made out of bone. It's made out of thin strips of keratin, so like what your fingernails are made out of, that are all basically cemented together to make a horn. Unicorn. Rhino horns are not actually true horns. And that's an important point for my next slide. So, if you want to build your own unicorn, there's a number of problems that you're going to have. The first problem is that horns are always paired. So true horns and antlers, as I was mentioning, these are extensions of the frontal bone of the skull. And the frontal bone is paired. And so the horns that grow out of them are also always paired. And as I mentioned, the rhino is a little bit of a special case. Some rhinos only have one horn, but again, that horn is not a real horn. It's not made out of bone. So they're a little bit of an exception. But with rhinos aside, all other horns and antlers are paired. And of course, the unicorn only has one horn. The next problem you're going to have is with the unicorn family tree. So just want to walk you through a few steps here. So the first term that I'm going to bring up, most of you know it, is ungulate. So ungulates are any kind of horned mammal. So there's basically two big groups of ungulates. There are what are called the perissodactyls, and these are odd-toed ungulates. So any any hooved mammal that has either one-toe or three-toed is a perissodactyl. So the most common example of that is a horse, also donkeys fit into this category, and tapirs and rhinos have got three toes, so they're perissodactyls as well. The other main group of ungulates is the artiodactyls. So these are the even-toed ungulates. So basically anything that has cloven hooves, like a sheep or a moose, cow, a deer, these are all artiodactyls. The only artiodactyl that actually has four toes is a hippo. So hippos fall into this group too. Now, if we were to put a unicorn in here, we would probably throw it in with the horses because they're most similar to horses. So we'll put the unicorn there. Now, if you look at these two different groups, look at the headshots. What is the main difference you see between the perissodactyls and the artiodactyls? Anyone want to?
The horns.
The horns, exactly. Exactly. So, perissodactyls have got no true horns or antlers, and artiodactyls have got true horns and antlers. And you can see the problem here is that the unicorn is falling into a group that doesn't have horns and antlers. So that's another problem. So, I'm going to introduce you to a little bit of what we call phylogeny. Don't be scared. It's actually really interesting. So it's basically, a phylogeny is basically just a family tree. So let's go back to when we have the very first ungulate, the very first hooved mammal. So we think the very first hooved mammal had 4 toes on its feet. Now over time, the artiodactyls, so those are the even-toed ungulates, they split off. So originally had 4 toes, the hippos got 4 toes, so it fits in this group, and then this group that branches off here lost 2 of its toes and evolved antlers, and these are what we have like in the cows, the pigs, the sheep, the deer, the moose, the giraffes. These all fit into that group as well. So, artiodactyls split off, and on this line we still have the perissodactyls. So the perissodactyls have lost a toe, so they only have 3 toes on their feet now. So we have the tapirs and the rhinos splitting off because they have 3 toes on their feet. And then afterwards we have those 3, in the group that comes off that, those 3 toes are reduced to 1 toe, and we're left with the equids. So equids are horses, zebras, and donkeys. And so we could put unicorns right at the very end here, because unicorns and horses are very similar, so they group together. Now the problem, as I mentioned before, is that the horns and the antlers are way over here on the artiodactyls. And the perissodactyls don't have horns, so the unicorns would have to gain a horn back basically, a horn would have to appear in this group as well as that group. And we know that generally, when we talk about evolution, that doesn't usually happen. So, that's a problem associated with the unicorn family tree. Now, don't lose hope. You could maybe still build a unicorn. So how would you do it? There's actually a gentleman called Franklin Dove. This was in around the 1930s, 1936. And he did exactly that. He wanted to build a unicorn. So he had this dream of a unicorn. He thought about, well, how can I make an animal that has 1 horn? So he did some reading up. He read into the literature of Pliny the Elder, Georges Cuvier, of J.W. Wood, and all these famous biologists. And he realized something. He realized that if you take a young cow, like a lot of times farmers want to dehorn their cattle soon after they're born. So what they do is they actually cut off the horn bud when the cow is very young, and so they cut off the horn bud, the horns don't grow. So Franklin Dove thought, well, what if I cut off the horn bud, but instead of throwing it away, what if I replanted it in the middle of the forehead? Would I be able to get a unicorn bull? And the answer, surprisingly, is yes. So Franklin Dove was actually able to make a cowicorn, basically a cow with only 1 horn that grew in the center of its forehead. And after this cow died, they actually looked at its skeleton. There's a whole bunch of literature that was written on it. So this was the original cow horn. Since then, this experiment has been redone again and again. So you can have things like cowicorns, you can have goaticorns, you can have sheepicorns. So basically any of those artiodactyls that have the 2 horns, you can cut off the horn buds and make them grow in the center of the forehead. So these are what I'm calling man-made Frankunicorns. So they're not natural, but you can basically make an animal that sort of looks like a unicorn. So, but in the wild, if you were to go out to the wild and look for a unicorn, you sometimes might find creatures that look very similar to unicorns. So these are what I'm calling naturally occurring Frankunicorns. So sometimes animals in the wild are born with mutations, making them grow either too many or too few horns. And of course they can also lose horns over the course of their lifetime. So this little guy is a roe deer. This was photographed in Europe. And this roe deer has this mutation that means it only has 1 horn that's growing out of the center of its forehead. This is an animal that wasn't engineered in any way. This was just a naturally occurring mutation. Same thing sometimes happens with the oryx. These are kind of antelope that live in Africa. And this is just an example of a oryx that only has 1 horn. And if you remember way back to when I was talking about that mythical, people bringing stories of mythical creatures from the Indus Valley and from Persia back, it's possible that what they were referring to were actually these deer-like creatures that had mutations that made them only grow one horn. So, but in general, if you want to build your own unicorn, unfortunately, we're still unable to put a horn on a horse. Sorry. But people don't try, people still try to fool people to think this is actually possible. So yeah, no horn. So in 1997, I don't know if any of you remember this, the mummified remains, quote unquote, of a baby unicorn were discovered inside a box in someone's collection. And everyone got really excited until they found out that that horn was actually a spiral seashell. And if you look really closely, this animal has got 2 horns. It has cloven hooves. And if you remember, the horses have only got 1 toe. And so this is probably a baby goat that just has a shell stuck to its forehead, sadly. Now, there's another aspect to unicorn mythology that I haven't talked about yet, and that is the idea of this stuff called alicorn powder. So an alicorn is basically a unicorn horn without the unicorn part. So a unicorn horn was thought to be this miraculous thing that if you ground it up, it would heal any ailment you could think about. So in the late medieval and Renaissance time, this alicorn and alicorn powder were the most sought after items in Europe because they were said to have these healing, magical, medicinal properties. And this stuff was so expensive, was so valued, that the common person never, ever, ever saw it. Like, it was reserved for royalty. And that may be why they were able to fool everyone into thinking that it had these magical powers, because almost no one had access to it, so, you know, you could tell people anything and they believe you. So, if we take a look at what these alicorns actually were. Oh, I should mention too, people would sometimes bring back unicorn horns. So they would come back with things that look like unicorn horns. So let's take a look at what some of those fake unicorns actually were. So common alicorns, or these unicorn horns, are primarily they're things like elephant and walrus tusks, sometimes also things like narwhal tusks as well. Occasionally there are also fossils turn up as these unicorn horns as well. Things like bacillite fossils. Baculites are basically squid that had a really long shell. Things like stalactites, these are the rocks that hang down from the tops of caves. And also just ground up bone. People just ground up bone and say, oh, this is alicorn powder, and sell it for $1 million or whatever it was. So these are just general examples of what alicorns were. There is one animal in the world that was called a unicorn, or its alicorn was referred to unicorns more often than anything else. And it belonged to this creature. So what is this creature? Narwhal. That's right. These are narwhals, and the narwhal has got a very long tusk. So narwhals, the scientific name is actually Monodon monoceros. It means one tooth, one horn, which is kind of redundant. But you can understand why it was called that. So this is a medium-sized toothed whale that lives year-round in the Arctic. It's an Arctic creature, actually related to belugas. So I didn't know that about narwhals before I researched them. The tusk is actually an incisor, so one of the front teeth, and it only grows out of one side of the head. So if you were to look at a narwhal like straight on, you can see that the tusk is actually only coming out of one side of its mouth. So both the male and the females have tusks, but the males are much longer. And what's just an interesting thing to note, sometimes narwhals are actually born with 2 tusks. So both of the incisors grow into tusks. So that's kind of a neat mutation for narwhals. But a lot of the time, people would find narwhal tusks. They look like this. This specimen, it's in the Redpath Museum in Montreal. This is about 2 meters long. So these tusks can get really, really, really long. So most of the alicorns that people had in their possessions actually belong to narwhals, at least from the Victorian times. So this is a very famous supplier of alicorns. So let's now look at what other creatures people mistook for unicorns over time. So one of the most common things that people mistook for a unicorn was something called an oryx, also called a California Gemsbok. And if you look at these creatures from the side on, they have very straight horns that point straight back. If you look from the side, it actually looks like they only have one horn. So this is a possible candidate for a mistaken unicorn. Other things like the Chun, these are from Mongolia. From the Kion, these are also from the Near East. The Indian rhino, even things like yaks, were sometimes mistaken for unicorns. So this is what I'm calling the historical unicorn imposters, the modern edition. There is also a fossil edition of unicorn imposters. So this is where the paleontology comes in. So this is what I was mentioning, that bacrolite fossil. They have these very long conical shells, which look a little like this. Sometimes these shells are covered in what we call amylite. It's a very shiny gem that looks like this. So you can see that if you find something that's long and conical covered in shiny material, you may well think it's a unicorn horn. Other unicorn imposters from the fossil record, things like gastropod fossils. Gastropods are snails. If you get the internal mold, they look like really long conical horns. Things like teeth and spines from a variety of animals, and also things like woolly rhinos. People would find only the top part of the skull, and they would assume they were looking at a unicorn. So when people found fossils in particular, they sometimes mistook them for unicorns as well. So, hunting for unicorns. If you're still not dissuaded and you still want to find a unicorn, where could you go? Well, you can go to the Canadian House of Commons, for example. I don't know how many of you have been, but as you go into the main doors, on one side there's a lion, on the other side there's a unicorn, making a really weird face. I don't know why you did that. But yeah, this is a unicorn. The Canada's coat of arms actually has a unicorn on it. So unicorns have also had this idea of being very powerful creatures, very regal creatures. So they're often depicted on coat of arms. Also, places like Hampton's Court, you can also find unicorns. Just one thing I'll point out, interesting thing to note, this unicorn has got cloven hooves. And so that's another branch of unicorn mythology, thought that unicorns are actually closely related to goats. So some unicorns actually have cloven hooves. Or you could just go to a toy store and find unicorns. So again, unicorns are everywhere. So sort of the take-home message, or the legacy of the unicorn, is really summed up well by this author, Chris Lavers, who actually wrote a book called The Natural History of Unicorns, about unicorn mythology. And he says, wherever the unicorn came from, it blossomed with the aid of real animals, a narwhal tusk, a horse's body, a Kiang's personality, and human's imagination. The unicorn binds other threads of the Earth's natural history to our own. If the beast is to stand for anything in the modern world, it can stand for that. And I think that really sums it up very well. So that is the end of this lecture. I'll just briefly mention, again, that this is part of a series. This was the first of 5. So if you want to keep up with the next lecture, they'll be in the local papers as well as on the Facebook page. And also you can just feel free to call and ask us. So the next one is in 2 weeks from now. It's called Overchill and Overkill. It's looking at the extinction of those really big Ice Age mammals, the woolly rhinos, the woolly mammoths, things like cave bears, these really big impressive creatures that suddenly went extinct when humans started coming out of Africa. So it's looking at whether or not humans were responsible for that extinction or not. It's a big debate in paleontology and archaeology. So please come up for that. And with that, thank you so much again for coming. And if you have questions, I would be happy to field them.